Hello, my name is Lowell, pronouns he, him, and I am the community manager for the Open Hearth Gaming Community. And this is another one of our series of group talks, seminars about particular topics. We've done a number of these. This time we're talking about long campaigns. Often on Open Hearth, the default has been here's a month, and we do a series that's 4 or 5 sessions. But we've had people now do longer series, quarterlies, 11, 12, 13 sessions, or groups of sessions that are then linked together to form a longer series. And that's been something we've been talking about. We also, we support people playing outside the community who are running longer campaigns for their home groups or for other online groups. So we're going to be talking about that. Now, I'm going to do is talk about a few topics and some setup things. I want to mention that there are some great resources out there for talking about long campaigns and managing those. There's a really interesting Kobold Guide to Plots and Campaigns, Robin Law's Guide to Good Game Mastering. Those are interesting things. If you are interested in longer campaign management, and I use that word very particularly, there is one resource I want to point people to kind of right off the top, a book called Odyssey. And this is by Walt Chenanowski and Phil Vecchione. This is literally just a book about campaign management from very much a project manager approach to things. I really like it. And, it's often we get these RPG books that are kind of topical and maybe they're kind of fun to read through. I think this one has a lot of good, solid advice to it. So I want to start with the question of what we get from a long campaign, just to kind of set some baselines. So when we're going to do a long campaign, they're attractive to us as GMs for a number of reasons. One is that a longer campaign allows us to show change over time. It allows us to have characters evolve, have the world evolve. It allows us to explore all of a world. If we've got a cool world, a cool setting, it gives us more of an opportunity to go and tour and try different places of it. It also gives us more of a chance to explore the system. If we've got a system that has a long evolutionary process, advancement, things like that, a longer campaign gives us a chance to try out all the cool corner abilities, get the, level 10 powers, all of that kind of thing. Another thing it does is it allows for, over time, maybe that something that a short campaign doesn't, everyone gets to do those combinations of interactions and scenes and developed arcs with the other players, with the other player characters. We had this just recently in the Rapscallion game. We're at about session 13, 14. And this last session, Patrick's character and Sherry's character, they had had some interactions, but they got really tightly thrown together in a way they hadn't before. And it completely changed the dynamic. We hadn't had a chance to explore that before. And it really, really played out in a different way than maybe we expected. And having a longer time to play gives you a chance to mix those up, come back to those, and change those things up. What are, though, some of the challenges for longer campaigns? Longer campaigns, we've certainly got higher risk involved. We can lose consensus. People can start to have different expectations. There are changes that occur in our life or in the game and so on that we have to deal with. There could be the general loss of energy. Certainly, scheduling issues are the bane of gamers, and longer campaigns can be really vulnerable to that. There's also, and I know I've experienced this, and I assume that all of you have as well, it's when you're playing a beautiful long game, but then you see that there's this other beautiful, shiny, long game over there, and you're not getting to play it because you're running this long game, and you have FOMO from this. This is a common thing for me. So one of the things I want to start with is the idea that we have to choose a system that is going to be sustainable for a long campaign. And in doing that, we need to know what the system can sustain, can manage. Many PBTA games have kind of a statute of limitations. They have a minimal length that you really need to play to get them up to speed, to explore and see what's going on in them. But there's also a point at which you've been playing long enough that your characters have really run through all their options. They've taken all their advancements. They've moved to the end. They feel bloated in some ways. It's one of the things that has not been copied, I think, in other games, but Apocalypse World originally had to take a second character. Not a lot of PBTA games have copied that approach as a release valve for that. But that's one of the considerations is how long can this game play for? I know Rich Rogers has been running a mass campaign for years, and he wanted to stop it several times because the characters had gotten too big and the players have wanted to keep playing. So they've had to reset the playbooks, kind of start from zero again with those same characters, which I think is a really interesting approach to that kind of thing. Some games have obviously a built-in set of structures and limitations. For example, Girl by Moonlight. Girl by Moonlight builds into itself. This is how long the campaign is. These are the events that are going to occur. This is what's going to build up. And to answer Jim's question in the chat, so I would say that the players feel that it is one campaign for that mass game, but I think Rich would say it's several campaigns linked together. I think there's a very different vision of that between the players and the GM. Other games that have structural things, Blades in the Dark, certainly it is built in that this campaign where our goal is to get our group bigger. It's not a set goal that we get to X thing, but it definitely has a sense that we were aiming for something that we're going to get to. Certainly, Band of Blades takes that in its logical conclusion by having a very set of structures and steps and points and things like that. But outside of PBTA, there are other games that do this. There are a number of OSR games and D20 games that have 10 levels. You will get to 10 levels. Specifically, I've run a lot of 13th Age, and it has those 10 levels broken up into 3 acts. We've got essentially our adventurer tier for the first few levels, then our heroic tier with this kind of jump up in power, and then our epic tier. And I have run a full 10 level campaign with that. One of the things I think you need to know when you're going into choosing that game is what that limitation is, but also having a sense of how many sessions it takes to get from A to B to C. How many sessions does it take for advancement? How many sessions does it take to go up a level? If that's a consideration, is there a difference between how the game expects advancement to happen and how you as a GM run it? I go back to 13th Age in this. 13th Age, again, I love this. Is D20. It's the closest to trad I get, I think, in a lot of ways. But it has this assumption that you have to have 4 fights before you have a complete rest, and you have to have a couple of complete rests before you go up a level. That's a lot of fights. I do not do that because I don't have a fight every session. I don't have 2 fights every session. Like that is not the way I run. So it is much more a milestone approach to me. Part of that is I know how long a combat in 13th Age is going to take when I'm running it. I'm not going to stop and do a combat that we're going to do 3 incidental combats in the session. That just is not what I want to get at. So curious about this. We've seen some people run different games that have had some structural things to them that have affected it. Anybody have thoughts, questions, things like that? Jim mentioned in the chat the cost pyramid. Can you talk about how that works in NBA? Jim, what you know about that?
Yeah, it's the structure that they have for anybody that's not familiar with Night's Black Agents. Ken Hite, who's one of the principal authors of it, pitches it as Jason Bourne versus vampires. Your burned spies that are fighting this vampire conspiracy, and they have a structure that they call the conspiramid, which is the conspiracy that you're fighting, and there's like you fight the low level vampires and kind of work your way up to the main vampire. And because there's that structure, the number of layers you put into the conspiramid there can, is a timer for the campaign. So that, because you're working your way up through to get to the main vampire, whether that's, Dracula himself or whomever, that you're going to fight your way up to this level. And then once you take out the vampire at that level, that's the end of the game. And so it's like a little similar to kind of the way that a lot of those Carver for Brindlewood games work, where you're kind of building your way up to that fight with the mastermind, and then that's the end of the game. But I really like it because you can, if you want a short campaign, you do a short conspiramid where there's only 3 layers of it or something like that you have to fight your way through. But if you want something that lasts a little longer, you make it 7 or whatever.
And I'll mention this. This is a thing to think about, that much like the sort of the Brindlewood Bay effect, that is a clock that the players can see. When we're playing online, players have an expectation. We're doing 10, 11, 12 sessions. They can see that is the length that we are going for. But if you're playing free play, if you're playing in a game where you're just playing or so on, maybe the players don't have a sense of that. One of these things that these do is provide a framework that players can see and measure. And as Garrett says, it's about a kind of transparency that helps align those expectations. Alan said something interesting in the chat. Some of like length and things like that, in terms of like how long it takes to do things and stuff, will depend on, do your players know the rules? This is a thing to consider. It's part of the kind of the choice of system and how it's going to impact. Are your players people who are going to buy the books? Are they going to buy the books and have a copy of it? Or are they just going to look at the spreadsheet? Or are they just going to work off of the cheat sheet? Because I think that makes a big difference, especially if you're playing a longer game where you're expecting the players are going to engage with the system. You may have players that don't. That is not their thing. They just want to play. And so the choice of system begins to really impact that. As a side tangent, I will say, and some of you may or may not agree with me, one of the biggest red flags, warning signs for players in a long campaign is if you see a player not spend their points. They don't take their advancements. They don't bother to level up. They're not spending points to buy new advantages. That is the biggest single red flag that you need to figure out what is going on with that player in a longer campaign, because that is not going to get better unless you deal with it, especially because they're already disengaged, and then they're going to get to a situation where they're underpowered and they're going to feel more frustrated, and it's going to be a loop, a cycle that is going on. Alan, you had said something about the definition of campaign and how we define that. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, only in as much as if I think of the first campaigns I ever ran, then they were endless. They were there as long as the players would turn up. And Garrett made the point about there's this implied big bad on the horizon. And then once you knock that one over, the beyond that is another peak to climb. But I think there's also that definition of campaigns that says, is it the same group of players playing every week for 20 years? Is it a rotating cast of players who come in and out of that setting, but the general thrust of the campaign is the same? They have the same campaign history that they build on, and they go forward from that. Is a set of series, like Night Witches, I think Jim ran it, start to finish every week, pausing for bank holidays and illness. Or can you run it as, we're going to chunk this down, we're going to do a couple of months, and then I'll offer you the chance to come back to this in another month's time. So I think campaign means different things to different people, I think is what I'm suggesting here.
Yeah.
What works for different models may be different.
Absolutely. And I think that is a thing that the GM should be thinking about at the start. I think that you want to at least have an idea of what you would like and communicate that to the players. Garrett summed this up in the notes. So we have some transparency things, fixed length, in-game goals, character progression ends. These are all timers, things that players can see. But having a discussion about what is the goal for the campaign, what distance that we're going to be moving through.
If I could
Yeah.
just build on that point, as part of my ongoing process of bigging up Grimwild, Grimwild has a model whereby you get 1 XP per session that you turn up to, and you are limited to 8 levels, and then done.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting one. It is one that you can then tweak a little bit in terms of how much you're going to do and how fast you're going to get through that. Jim asked about how I'm structuring Star Trek Adventures, and I want to talk. I'm going to kind of jump forward. I have some notes here about approaches to campaign length and what a campaign might mean. So for me, I'm running a lot of Star Trek Adventures, and particularly for one series, Star Trek Kensuke, I have structured that as seasons. There is a discrete season that's a quarterly, and we have a set of characters for that. And when we get to the next quarterly, we have some of those same characters returning. We definitely know that we've got the continuity. We got the secondary characters and NPCs between that. Now, mind you, that's also broken up in that I very much structure those games as 2 sessions as an episode. So there are blocks that are being built up that we can do. We're carrying on. It is a linked campaign thematically, but we might have a very different crew between these things. And when I say quarterly, because we tend to break things up into months on the Open Hearth, quarterly just means like probably like a 3-month series here is what I'm talking about. I have done that breaking up of a campaign into arcs several times. I did Fearful Symmetries with Alan and some others. We did a 12 session arc, and then a year later, we did another 12 session arc with those same characters, where literally in the game world a year had passed. We used the timing of the real world and matched that up. I've also done Godbound. I love Godbound, and I broke that up into 3 12 sessions, and I did not intend that at the start. We hit the end of that first 12 sessions, and I was like, this is really good. I would like to come back to this. And so we took some time off and we came back. It was also one of those games where we actually added a new person. Ethan came in and joined us at that point, which was fun and interesting and mixed things up. It also provided a new perspective because Ethan's character could come in and go, wow, you're all really weird, and bring in a kind of a grounded reaction to what was going on in the game. That was a really fun way to do that. I have broken up campaigns even smaller. I've done quarterlies where each month is a book. Basically, my focus has been in this first month, we're going to do a 3 or 4 session story. Then we're going to have a little bit of a break time, and then another 3, 4 session story. We have another little break time with the idea that it's a trilogy or it's a series of comics. That's another way to structure that. Another thing is I ran for a very long time a school campaign, a fantasy school campaign, and that was very much broken up into years. And here's the opening of the school year, midpoint, big bad at the end of the school year. Then we have a break and we come to the next year. And that formed a very conscious structure for the players and a very conscious structure for the GM. One of the nice things is that if we have those kinds of longer structures, longer plays, we can also maybe dive out and have our characters play NPCs in the setting to get other perspectives on things. That length and those campaign structures, especially when we get them sort of linked up and such, we can do interim episodes between campaign arcs. We can dive down and see what the NPCs are doing. Jim, can you talk about, Alan asked this, can you talk about how night witches function for you with the cast rotation and things like that?
I ran a Night Witches game on Open Hearth kind of pre when it was called something else, back in the kind of the Gauntlet days. And because at the time we were pretty explicit about wanting stuff to be open table, I ran that as an open table game, kind of modified so that I put each month worth of sessions up as its own thing and people could sign up. And because of the nature of Night Witches, where you're playing pilots in World War II, it was really conducive to having people drop in and out as they wanted to. And we had a few players that kind of stuck with it through most of the entire series. But we also had people that just came in for literally across the like that year plus game, just 1 or 2 sessions where they could make it for one session. They're like, after we'd been running it for a few months, they're like, hey, I heard this is really cool. I just want to check it out. They drop in for 1 or 2 and their pilot is there. We bring them in. And if they like it, they can come back. But you can get transferred and whatever. You're not flying. You're working on the plane. You're a mechanic instead or something like that. And people would explicitly say whether if they left, if they didn't stay with us, do you want your character to become an NPC that we can mess with? Or do you want to go off somewhere else so that conceivably you could return and come back? And, and it was probably about 50-50 with people deciding whether they, wanted to maintain the option to come back with that same character or whether they were happy to read 3 months from now that they had, gotten shot down over, Warsaw or something like that later in the game. But it worked really, really well. And I think by the time it was over, we had close to 18 or 20 different players through the whole thing. But like I said, with a core, maybe half a dozen, 6 to 8 that played really regularly, throughout the campaign. The timing on that is World War II. And so kind of everybody has a pretty good idea of what that means. And so we knew it was going to end with the end of the war.
I'll say this, and then I want to throw to Garrett on a really interesting point. When I did my mass campaign, that was a quarterly, I could look because I had put all the months out, but they were kind of broken into months. I could see who was in each one, who was carrying over and who wasn't. And that gave me a way to, when I was thinking about things, knowing what we needed to do, where we needed to get to, how we needed to have people exit or come back in. Garrett, could you talk about the concept of the magic circle in gaming and how that relates to campaigns?
Yeah, happily will do so. I recently wrote a blog article about it, unfortunately in German, though translation tools can be of help there. Because I have a blog specifically for my last campaign, which was running for 7 years. That was a traditional campaign, a fantasy module, which was big in the 90s in the German Dark Eye. But I translated it to indie mechanics and tried to do it as modern as possible, like taking the best from the 90s and bring it into our times. And for that, I also thought very actively about the magic circle. That is a concept from game theory. Whitaker is, I think, the theorist behind it, which says that the play begins much earlier. And it's not just the playtime when we come together, but it's also when you announce a campaign, when you talk about the campaign in between, when you prepare the session, the GM is already playing in a certain sense. When you at home think about your next advance you want to pick for your character, there's a way to play. And categorizing all these different elements which make the campaign, I found very useful and in a campaign especially important, because a campaign for me is so much more a collaborative exercise than a single session, where it's more kind of a mastermind sits down and has an idea on what they want to do in that session. And then the players join you and just celebrate what you developed. And in a campaign, I want to see that differently. The way I want to see campaigns and how we play them in the community is that we think about what is coming next, what worked, what didn't work, how do we want to progress, how do we define the ending, and so on. We do this together. And I like this very much. And so expectation management is something we take time for. We look at how does the group develop, not only single characters, but also the group dynamics you can look at. You can think about doing a workshop about a certain element. You can think about rules, how to discuss rules. And if you categorize this, like the elements which are important to you, and think together about like how you want to spend time on them beside play, I think this can alleviate your play experience a lot. Yeah, that is something where I say the magic circle needs to be seen and appreciated. Yeah, it is something which is our play, not just the 3 hours we just play, so to say.
I think that's so important, knowing what your players know about the game that you're playing, what their expectations are. One of the things that has happened that's been a little bit different between the different Star Trek games that I've run is that Star Trek game has benefited from people knowing the TV show, from people having watched the TV show. They know the dramatic stuff, but they also know what Starfleet is. They know what Star Trek is. It was an interesting and learning experience to me when I ran an original series, TOS series. Rich doesn't know original series. Like, he knows Star Trek, but he doesn't know original series. And he was fine, but he was super, super uncertain about his own knowledge. And that is a thing to be aware of. What do people know? How do we invite them in to the thematics of this kind of thing? So there's a really interesting, the officials have done a couple of books. One of them they've done is this book of proactive role playing, this theory about having, at the start of the game, your characters define goals for themselves, short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, and then you build the campaign around that. I think this is a great idea. I think this is a wonderful idea, but the players need to know what the game is going to be. Even if you're collaboratively building the game or the game world, if they don't have a strong sense of what you're going to be running, of what the game is, they're going to have trouble with that. I did a Mutants and Masterminds game. We did some collaborative building, and then I went to try and use that sort of proactive approach, but people got stuck because the players had very different expectations about what a Supers game was, and some of them had never played a Supers game, and some of them had never read comic books. The dramatic level of difference created a really intense approach there. And I thought, okay, it's a collaborative building. Certainly it'll be fine. But yeah, that setting knowledge is really important there. Let's talk about some tools here. One of the things that is appealing about a long-term campaign is that when you do a session 0 and do some building and stuff, like, that's going to pay off potentially. That effort, that investment is going to be cool. So we can do collaborative building. We can use tools like Microscope to build histories. We can use Microscope to build cities. We can do map building to start out. We can really focus in on entanglement building, all of those kinds of things. And I love that. I think it's really fun. I'm curious about what folks have found as successful tools for doing that building, that preparation for long campaigns, either specific to a particular game or in general. Alan?
Maybe there's something to be said here about how are you collecting information about the campaign so that when either new people drop in or there's a break and you pick it up again, that campaign history remains accessible and can be built on, rather than a feeling of, oh gosh, yeah, we're starting from scratch again. And I suppose Will H and I have used Miro to map our vampire games across, gosh, dozens of sessions now. And I think probably we're up to about 15, 16 different players across time.
Oh, wow.
And that conspiracy board does the job of, here's the history of the game. Don't know if that's helped.
Yeah, no, I think it is. It is a challenge, though. Like, that's a massive information, and players should know what their expectations about how much do I need to know, how much can I grok in play, like what can I get from that. Jim?
Yeah, I mean, I am just in the habit now of any time I do a game that's going to be more than 4 or 5 sessions, I just make a Discord for it. I'm very text oriented. I like just thinking about a Miro board makes my head spin because it's graphic design, which is not a thing I can do. But like in terms of information organization for our Band of Blades game, we've got a Discord that has a whole lot of stuff in there, like recaps of every mission. And then before the mission, we list out all the, here's the potential missions, and you guys yickety yak about it and stuff like that, and what you might take and everything. And so it's all there for anybody that wants to pursue it. Like we have one player who really can kind of only engage in the game for the 3 hours that we're playing. But I know that like he'll like take 15, 20 minutes before just kind of do catch up on everything. And then he can jump into the game and be privy to that conversation that's going on. But and that's the thing I like about Discord is it's got that kind of sort of wiki function where we can record all of that, but it also facilitates conversation between sessions. I just think Discord's really, really great for that.
Garrett, you mentioned about a tool that you're using to kind of keep that continuity.
Yeah, tool might be a big word for what I'm doing, but similar to end of session questions, I always ask every session, every player to write down one sentence, how their character has changed in the session in relation to the main theme of the game, of the campaign. And that makes such a difference because at the end of the campaign, after let's say 17 sessions, as we played in this large campaign I mentioned before, you can now read through the whole story character arc by going back to the table where we put per session, per player, the stories in. And then you can read from left to right and see like what happened in a specific session, but you can also read top down and see like how the characters have developed. And that was such a nice tool. And we used this at the end of the campaign to see like what we made through, what our characters had to go through. And that was pretty amazing. And I like to have this, all this kind of graveyard engravings you could make out of this.
I love it. I want to talk about another sort of approach to informational organization before I come and talk about Microscope and my experiences and ask about other people. Here's what I learned from Ray. For me, I don't do Moreau. I don't do text. For me, campaigns are organized by NPCs very much. And I do this both online. Those NPCs broken up into their sections are how I visualize it. But I do this for my face-to-face game. I will print out character pictures, and we have a baseball card binder, and we'll organize them there. That for me is the way that I approach that. Ray kind of taught me that. How is that kind of coincide with your experience, Ray?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm also the kind of GM where you can nudge me slightly and an NPC will come out like fully grown. But I feel like NPCs are such a good tool to mirror PCs, but they're also a good tool to store information about setting and factions and relationships and cataloging changes across a campaign. It's really great, especially like a long campaign. One of my favorites when we were playtesting Twilight Throne was there was an NPC, a bad guy called the Pawn, and she was at best a nuisance, but she kept surviving. She kept coming back to life in wretched, awful body horror ways. But after like about, I want to say like, it was like 20 something sessions, I got to have her deliver a killer line of, if a pawn lives long enough, it becomes a queen.
Oh,
and that's when she like evolved into this really badass, horrible version of herself and became the big bad that no one expected. And so I got to store a lot of information in that particular NPC. And I find it's just easier for players to remember. I mean, this depends per player, but for a lot of my players, it's easier to remember important information if it's connected to another character, it's connected to an emotional or relationship thing, rather than just pure lore setting information that can be harder to keep track of.
Absolutely. It definitely is the way that I approach that. I would want to talk then about a point that, like, I've used Microscope a lot. When Microscope first came out, I was like, this is it. This is absolutely it. It is my bag, 100%. And I remember using it, and then I remember bringing it to my players, and some of my players were like, fuck this. And it wasn't until we sat down and did it that they were like, oh, okay, because they were worried that other people would screw up the world. Like that was literally, they said this multiple times. And it was one of those things about getting comfortable with building consensus and things like that, which I think is probably we're less in that era now, but this is right when Microscope came out. I've used Microscope to build worlds. We did 13th Age. 13th Age has a lot of setting assumptions that are built into it, but we built a history and we modified some of those setting assumptions based on what was done there. But I've also done it where I said, we're going to build a fantasy world. And they built a fantasy world, or we're going to build a fantasy world where it's Fantasy Battlestar Galactica. And that's all I gave them. And then we built the world from there. And those have been really fun and successful and things like that. The question is how much people engage with those things. One of the things I found, and Dominic mentions this in the chat, is when you get a lot of information, how much people engage with those, how much we get to use them. One of the things I found with the 13th Age game is in the Microscope thing, they created the icons, essentially the big powers of the world. Those came back quite a bit. But a lot of the specific details of the history got dropped out. I would bring them in, I would reference them, but they weren't important to the players. They liked the vibe when they saw something that they'd created. And some players would build on the things that were in the history, but I realized that that was less important to the players, so I drifted that back. I de-emphasized that. I think where I've had players more engage is where it's not history, where it goes backwards in time away from where they're at, is when I've done games where they built the city that they're living in, where that is a thing that is temporally present in their engagement. So if a player goes and looks at history, like, how am I going to bring that into play? If I go and look at the city and the neighborhoods and the people that are in it, that's something I can engage with.
Yeah, and this is just my hang up with it, but I feel like Microscope emphasizes in some ways, like there's consensus building at the start when you create the palette and all of that, but in play it encourages you to don't pull the table, don't ask the other players, just decide what you want to see there. And I think that both creates a sort of hesitancy for actually going for the cool big things because you don't know what the other players will think about it, and it makes the players hesitant about what the other players will do. So for me, but that I don't know how much this is a play style thing and a personality thing, but for me that works against the good of the game.
I think that's right, because while some people are really comfortable with reincorporation, where you set a standard that you're not supposed to kibitz, you're not supposed to do that, it makes people hesitant to take something that somebody else has done and modify or play with it and so on. And I think that is a disadvantage to it. And so I think there are ways to modify that. There are some other tools that are out there that are kind of interesting. There's the Deck of Worlds and the Oracle Story Generator. These are interesting ones. These are very physical object kind of ones. There's a Tome of World Building, which sounded pretty, but is just a lot of tables for building stuff that I don't think you can actually use at the table, of very much a solitaire thing. Alan, what's Arium?
Yeah, Arium, actually, I don't know if he still is, but he was a community member for a while. It's a
People are always community members, whether they're with us or not. They are community members in spirit.
They are future community members. William Munn kickstarted this a little while ago. Oh gosh, several years ago. And it has Arium Create, which is the idea of creating a game. And I think it walks a decent line between the consensus where everyone is happy or everyone just takes what I as the GM put in front of them, and everyone feeling they've got some ownership of the final creation. Because I think trying to get consensus in any kind of table of players is probably it would be perfection, but I settle for the practical.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, Arium, you can look it up on drive-through. It's available there. Oh, Jim, talk about Starforged and Ironsworn
Yeah.
as a campaign prep. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they're designed to be played as solo games if you want to. I mean, for the most part, people end up playing them as kind of more traditional role-playing games, but they're explicitly meant to be played as solo if you want to play them. So there's a lot of tables and world generation stuff, good questions that help you build a campaign world that you can then drop your solo character into without having to get consensus from a whole bunch of different people on building that, if that's something that you're interested in. It's kind of the same. Ironsworn is Iron Age fantasy stuff. Starforged is space opera SF. And Sundered Isles is sort of like pirate, rapscallion flavored type of stuff. So, and they're all pretty neat to take a flip through if you get the PDFs.
I want to mention here with those an interesting thing to consider, that those tools are really solid online, where it's very easy for everyone to look at the tables, to have them as reference. It is a different beast in person, because usually you have either you're passing the book around or you have one person who is reading from it. And I think that changes the dynamic significantly between, because there is that interruption, there is that break of flow. People, if one person has the book, you're sitting there waiting for your turn. You don't have a chance to look at the tables or whatnot. I think that is a significant consideration. I'm going to come back to tools that we have for when we're actually running, once we actually get our bike pedaled and rolling. But Garrett asks about group collapse, about playing with a fixed group. Long campaigns mean commitment to standard, how to handle group collapse. Why do groups collapse? This is one of those ones where I want to ask for people's experience with this. I have been doing this long enough, and I have traditionally run long campaigns such that I have seen some amazing bullshit in my life. Things coming crashing down. I've had a couple of times where players have blown up at the table, where they had a very different expectation of the game, and everyone else at the table were on the same page and one player wasn't, and that created a problem. I had a game where a player had a kind of what I'm going to describe as a persecution complex, such that any negative thing that happened to their character they perceived as personal attack, and that caused a problem. But I've also seen personal dynamics, divorces. I had a great campaign that was going wonderfully. We were moving up towards a conclusion, and one of the sort of key players, the one who'd been there since the beginning, it was a small table. Smaller tables are more risky. 3 players, lose 1 player. That's 1 leg of a tripod. And they had an argument with their partner, and they decided that in order to show their partner, they were going to quit all their games, and they didn't tell me. And they didn't give me a chance to do a wrap-up session, and suddenly that game just crashed and burned. Can people talk about their experiences? Dominic, you mentioned in the chat the apocalypse keys, how you've managed that.
Yeah, I've been running a game since we're in session 17 now, so do the math. It's like 4 or 5 months, and we started as a wish fulfillment thing for our community member Shane, and Shane stayed with us for the entire run of the quarterly, and then just daylight savings caused them to drop out. Another player dropped out for just personal commitment reasons. And then other players cycled in. With every new mystery, I put in a post in the request players as long as I have a session. I keep it on the calendar for that reason as well. So people see that there's still a seat open, but I do realize that the time slot is not great for many people. But I think it really helps to have a big community like we do. And also that Apocalypse Keys has these very distinct mysteries, and you always also play them in a new city. So that's really easy to integrate new players and cycle through them. It would be more different in a more, let's say, personalized game, but I feel Apocalypse Keys is still very personalized. It is just that you have these built-in, let's call them change points, where it's a new city, So it's a great moment to say, hey, we have a new player, and that player has been the local agent for Division all along, and now they get to join the gang. And somebody else goes full ruin, as Shane did, or just quietly disappears.
I think that's a really interesting thing you're mentioning too about how easy is it to integrate, to bring characters in. That mission-based structure of Apocalypse Keys invites that. There are games like, I think, Masks in some cases, Hearts of Wulin in others, where there's a strong building of those relationships between characters at the start that can be a real challenge when somebody new comes in and having to restructure those, to build into those, to find their place in that. Dominic?
I noticed though that Apocalypse Keys has this as well, like these relationship building questions in the beginning. Our problem was, so what do we do with that? And we just ended up always asking the same question again. So it's always like, you love me, but I can't return that. And you would think that only works for one character, but it doesn't. Like we have the same question answer towards like several players by now and several characters. There's always somebody whose love you can't return, you know.
Absolutely.
You can just reuse the questions.
One of the things I want to mention in this is you have someone depart. As a GM, what are the things what are you going to do now? You can bring somebody else in. If you're going to bring somebody else in, especially if there's been a changeover where somebody has played for a long time and maybe the departure was acrimonious, this is a time to really talk to the table. It is a time to talk to the table, but I cannot stress this hard enough. Do not denigrate the player who left. Do not talk them down. Do not talk down their character. Don't do shit to their character. There is an instinct. I mean, I played for a long time, and I played in the eras of adversarial GMs. If you do that, that is corroding to the trust at the table. If you swack somebody's character, what I typically do when that happens is we quietly move them aside. They move out. We don't reference them. We take them out of the picture, or we give them a happy ending, but make it clear to the players that that is kind of off the table. I think that's really important. Sometimes it involves retconning. Sometimes you go, because this has happened, these players were involved with this, we're going to play in a different way, not doing this to spite this character or spite this player, but we're doing this to manage expectations going further forward. That's super, super important. And there is, and I think Dominic points at this, there's a real difference between playing this online and how easy it is to bring someone in or slide someone in and out, as opposed to having to play face to face. People know this, but last year I had a game, I had a player I had played with for 20, 30 years, and he died. And at that point, I didn't want to run that campaign anymore. We had been playing it long enough. I just couldn't do it. And his spouse was playing with us, and she played with us for a while, but I knew that there was a clock on that. I knew that she would feel eventually this would be too much for her, and it was. And I think that those kinds of dynamics, we cannot neglect that social component. Jim's been around long enough as me, so I know you have some horror stories.
Yeah, just really briefly, I guess one of the things that you should establish at the beginning, if it's going to be like a tight game with people you know, is so it's the five of us. If somebody has to drop out, what do you guys want to do? Mm-hmm. And that's a pull the table thing. That's not a thing that you can decide as the person running the game. Are we going to bring in somebody new? Or are we going to bring in, is it going to be somebody completely new? Is it going to be somebody we know who we've been talking to the game about, like whatever, our friend who, hasn't been able to make it on Wednesday nights and then suddenly they can. And that feels like a conversation that should kind of happen at the very beginning and then sort of be open as you're going. What do we do if someone gets in? I've had to drop out of a couple of games because of job crap, which is super frustrating for me. And I hate to do it to the people that, that I'm in the game with, but you gotta eat. So that can be really frustrating. But it just, like, at the beginning, you should figure out, how you think you're going to handle that and go from there.
And people may have been polite when they thought a person wasn't going to be in the game. And then you're like, I'm going to invite Rob. And suddenly I'm like, I don't want to play with Rob. Rob and I do not get along. We do not like each other. I don't want to have to drop, but I also don't want to say to the GM, no, please don't invite Rob.
Or 8 months ago when you started, you were fine with Rob. And since then, like, something has happened. So yeah, that's the long campaign thing.
Yeah. Alan?
Yeah, I put in the chat. I've never been blessed with living for an extended period of time in a decent sized city. And so too often I have run campaigns with whoever I could get, and that is not a good place to be, either at the start or 8 months in.
I will say I have played in the same city all my life, and this group that I have has been pretty continuous since 1996 in some form, which is good and bad. There have been change outs because in that long amount of time, there are some people who have changed their political views, have changed their personality in a way that I'm like, I do not want you in my house anymore. And I think that's a real consideration. And it's tough because I have some of my friends who really believe in the social contract and hate conflict. They are conflict adverse. So they are not willing to call people on bullshit. And I am too old to not call people on their bullshit. So it's tough. Garrett, and then I want to come back to something that Ray said in the chat.
Yeah, indeed. And I wanted to come back to something Jim said in the chat, which is that if it happens that your game collapses, and then next week again, you don't play, and 3 weeks later you still don't play, don't worry too much. And I say this to myself as strongly as I can, and still I struggle with it. It's so difficult to see something where you're excited to play, to continue, and then it just doesn't happen because people are not fully aware of their schedule sometimes, or just bad things happening and so on. It's somebody's fault even. And still, you shall not blame them. You shall not put like too much pressure on anybody. Relax, take a deep breath in, and wait for next week. Life will continue. Humans are always more important than a campaign. You can also say here, and yet it is difficult, and obviously sometimes you need to talk about like reliability and the schedule and so on. And yet it is one of the most challenging parts for me if things are not happening time-wise as I expected. That's for me like a burden. But the worst is if you try to punish the group by also not offering new sessions and wait even longer for continuing. That's the worst. And in the chat, I also put like what I once collected in terms of how to avoid a group contract. And a couple of things which are not mentioned yet is one is like celebrate that you are playing together. Like really like show your appreciation to the others, like that it is fun to play together, that it is wonderful to be together and to develop a complete new cosmos together. That is such an achievement. Don't forget to celebrate and also to say like it is in our times and with our life circumstances not easy to come together, and so appreciate that people make the time and are there for the game, no matter in which role. But also like divide the burden. Maybe it doesn't have to be the facilitator organizing the next session date or so. Like maybe that can also be done by somebody else and not always the same person. And then also rethink the schedule. Maybe the campaign was expected to go for too long, then make it shorter if that makes it easier for people to commit and find a difference. And so I think talking obviously is the summary of all this, like talking to each other and being there for each other. Yeah, but also when the time comes, accept that it is over and maybe go out of it without a blow.
Let me point to just a last bit, sort of a button on this. Ray said in the chat, and I think this is a very true statement, that the ideal number of players is 3.5. That is the ideal number. Because you want to have enough people that if one person doesn't show up, it is cool. You want to have that. 3 players is super risky. That 1 player's gone, as I said, tripod. 4 players, 1 person's gone. As a GM, you can go, okay, I can call it or we can play. There's enough room there. 5 players, even more of that, but then you're also dealing with 5 players. And my dudes, I ran too many years of 6 and 7 player tables. I never want to do that again. That was too much. But I ran years and years of that. But we also played till 1 or 2 in the morning, which I do not do that anymore. That is not my thing. I want to talk a little bit. I think there's some tools for managing long-term campaigns. We talk about Moreau boards. I think that things like I've done a bunch of decks for events for different kinds of campaigns that are really useful to inspire you when you get stuck on what to do. I have a set of worksheets that I've made that if we're playing a long campaign, it's like when I'm like, okay, where are we going now? I have a set of questions that I ask myself that I write 3 things in answer to each of these. And then I like, here are 3 things for each character. And I'll do that. That takes an hour. And I work off that for weeks. There are some tools that are out there that you don't use at the table that you can get done in an hour, which for me, my prep time, I try to keep that tight. As I've said before, we pump the pedals on the bike and then we coast for a while. That is my strategy for doing things. Another thing that's an advantage to long-term games. Long-term games allow you to do one-off special bullshit. It allows you to do a special event like, okay, and now it's an arena fight, or now everybody's going to a ball, or now you have to plan a party. Think about that. The one thing I want to say about that before I kind of maybe open it up and maybe we talk a little bit about endings is this: change up the energy. One of the things we learned in improv is about if we're at this level, we're going this direction, we switch off and we go another direction. That change, that frisson between that change ups, that's as important. If we've done, I mean, it's as simple as if we've done a bunch of fight sessions, we've got to do a session where the players have a chance to decompress, to talk. It's built into some games, like the downtime from Forged in the Dark. But Jim mentions the shore leave episode, the one-shot episode. We've done a space battle. Now we want to be on a planet. I very consciously do this in a Star Trek game so that we're not getting back to back of the same energy, the same tone. I think that's a really important thing. Let's talk about what other people want to have questions on, thoughts, ideas. I haven't talked about when to wrap up, when endings are, but anything anybody wants to ask question-wise, Ray?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one of my personal favorite tricks is to be in the same campaign with the same players, but switching to a different game, a different system with different characters. So, for example, we were playing Brinkwood, Blood of Tyrants. And so, because I love Brinkwood so much, I designed 2 fan games for Brinkwood. And so, one is a Belonging Outside Belonging game, which is about the refuge, which is really about the community building as a way to remember who are you fighting for? You're fighting the vampires, you're building community, but who are these normal people who are waiting back home? And then there's also the other game, which is based on Trophy Dark, which plays out the Fae who lost to the vampires and what they exactly lost and all that colonial violence. And so switching between those 3 games, mainly focusing on Brinkwood and the Forge and the Dark one, but then once in a while we'll have like, oh, this is what happened in the distant past. This is what the Fae lost, this artifact, and then it'll show up again in a future game. Or my favorite thing to do is I will quotation mark confront the players with their own PCs from the other games. Sherry is always really funny about that when when she has to deal with her other character from another game. But it helps create like all these different NPCs, and it helps like deepen the game, and I'm doing it along with the players, and it feels like a really fun break of like tone or looking at different parts of the campaign before you switch back to the main game. Is one of my favorite things to do.
One of the things that I did with a game that I'm probably most proud of, that I keep thinking back on how I can do it with other games, is at the end of that big Night Witches game that we ran, I invited every player who had ever played in it during the course of the entire run to come back for a final session that was like the History Channel documentary story of that unit. And so everybody got to say, like, even if their character had died or whatever, we would give them the opportunity to be like somebody commenting, like one of their relatives commenting on it or something like that. And some of them actually played their characters in their whatever 80s or 90s and stuff like this, reminiscing back. And we had like black and white photos and little montages and stuff like that. But it was a really neat way to include everybody in on that, and not just whatever the 5 players that happened to be there for the last session when VE Day happened. And it was a really neat way to do that. So some kind of, like, if you've had more than just a core group, some kind of way to include everybody that's been in on it, so that the last session isn't just we beat the bad guy, we all go yay, and then that's the end of it. But to have some kind of final session that is kind of purely narrative, but that gives everybody a chance to reflect on what has gone on before.
So let me hard frame a little, because I think that's the great jumping off point. Let's hear in this last 10 minutes, let's talk about endings. Let's talk about how you wrap up games. One of the things that I've seen people do that I really like is the idea, especially as we're getting towards the end of a game, is saying to players, is there anything new that you want to do or explore with your character? Getting their headcanon out on the table when you're coming towards the end. It helps where you kind of know that is going on. We just recently had a talk about what kinds of activities, what kinds of games, things like what Jim just said, that you can use to finish off a campaign in a satisfying way. In particular, we got referenced a world-ending game, which is a collection of mini games of different approaches for ending campaigns. Anyone have thoughts about things that you've seen that you've liked that have been good ways to end campaigns, or that have not worked? Like, I'll just say this. When I learned about epilogues, that changed me, because I had a couple of big campaigns that I didn't do epilogues for, and it was a huge mistake. Other people want to talk about endings that have worked or tools that you've used?
May I share the ending of my last big campaign, which
Please.
was playing physically again after many years of playing online. So a special occasion for the very end of the campaign anyway. And I asked every player to bring one object representing their character with them. And I prepared a little box, and we made a funeral for our characters at the end, and digging that box, a hole for that box, and put it into the garden with candles and everything, and singing the campaign song and everything. That was quite touching, I have to say. And so I just had to mention this here, and honoring the time we had together. And still, when I visit this friend in whose garden I know we have this graveyard, it's a very touching moment. And these objects of representing the characters feel pretty real. Yeah. So, and the time we spent together. So that was something I will not forget, because, well, it's an actual physical place. Yeah. And that is maybe a generalizable lesson out of that. Having something representing the campaign, like leaving like an artifact from the campaign behind. This can be virtual, obviously, like a virtual background for your screen or something. That is something I allow myself to have as a memory, as a warm memory. And and keep that warm feeling as long as you can together. And as a social bonding after such a long time spent together.
I'll mention one technique I saw. I wish I had done it. I really do. Like, when I saw it, I was like, oh shit. We had a big, long fantasy campaign that a friend ran, and we got to the last session, and there was the fight against the big bad. And one of the player characters, got essentially detached from time in that fight. And so what we then saw were epilogues that were done where this character was bouncing through time in that moment and seeing the future. And players got to narrate. The GM had some framework for it, had some things, and it was epilogues that were kind of in the play of the game. It was really interesting. It was really fun, and I dug that a lot. Other people endings. Ethan, who is apparently cruel, wants to do a game where you run a game using the Oz setting book and then destroy everything and then run Dark Designs and Verdigris. So I kind of love that. Anything else people want to say about endings? I think they're hard. I think it's hard to
Very
decide
hard.
when
Yeah.
you want to end. I think that is one of the big challenges. You do need to get feedback. You do need to tell the players ahead of time. I have never, when I've gone to players and said, I think we're going to wrap it up, I have never had players go, yes, please. I always go, I've got so much left I want to do. But, there are signs. There are signs like when you're getting burned out. There are signs when you're losing interest, when you feel like maybe you've jumped the shark in the game, when you've done the big thing and you're not sure how to top it. I think you have to be really conscious of that. There's a real difficulty to doing that wrap and getting that button on it.
I'm just speculating on the best way to end a campaign is not to end it, in the sense that if you, and I've only managed this once as described in the chat, which was to take a long-term fate campaign in a low fantasy world, and then we killed the big bad, we dealt with the big bad, everyone had a good time, and next time you take off the VR headsets and go back to your everyday life as an edge runner in Night City. And that worked very well. We then played Cyberpunk Fate for a little while. It was like starting from scratch, but everyone was still bound together by events that had happened previously, and we kept getting references back to it.
Oh, I love that. I have done this where I ran a long, sort of 3-arc superhero campaign, and we finished that up, and then we were done, and we did a microscope session to decide what happened over the next 20 years. What happened, and then we ran a near future cyberpunk game in that world based on the history that we've made. I think that there are some interesting tools for building connections and things between those that allow that to really develop. Ethan, I do have one question here before I want to wrap, because I have referenced you a couple of times in this talk. Would you be willing to talk about the challenges you felt when you've been brought in a couple of times into existing campaigns and what that was like?
Yeah, sure. I was mostly worried about stepping on anyone's toes, especially in the beginning setup where you establish relationships with other characters and things like that. And I didn't want to, it's fun to mess with other people's storylines and to challenge them and complicate them when you know what they are. I don't want to do that accidentally. So that was a thing I had to be really careful of. And the other was that I just frequently didn't know the setting. I didn't understand what was and wasn't possible. Mm-hmm. So I the reason my character was so grounded in that Godbound thing is I didn't know what was possible. So I erred on the side of lower powers. So I was like, I don't know what I can do. I don't know what. Okay, I'm going to play a complete noob who has no, they have powers. They have no idea how to use them because I don't know what I can get away with. And I don't want to have to stop every 5 minutes and be like, can I do this? So I eased into it and started out super low powered, just partly because I didn't want to break anything. I didn't want to interfere with any ongoing stories that I didn't know about, and I didn't know what the world would allow. It worked out fine. It ended up being very fun, but there is some stress there jumping into an established campaign with just not knowing what's allowed, mm-hmm. both by the game and by the established setting and by what the players have going on.
That's a really good point. For GMs to be aware of. I think you're hitting at something that I think is so important is GMs giving players a sense of what the permissions are. What do you have permission to do? How do you want to do that? Modeling that early. And I thought you did a brilliant job with that, especially in that Godbound game. So that was great.
I'm glad it worked out. Like I said, it ended up being great for me too. But yeah, it definitely was some because I think Godbound is a little bit like the game itself is a little bit confusing as to what you can and can't do.
Yeah. There are other things to talk about, but we are here at the last 5 minutes. So this is where I bring the campaign to an end, where we would do epilogues now and stars and wishes and all of that, roses and thorns. But I want to thank you all for joining me here today to talk about this, to talk about long campaigns. There's lots of stuff to discuss. I'm glad to see people are doing more long campaigns on the calendar. I'm just now gearing up to start a new long campaign. I'm in that process of thinking about, okay, how do I want to structure it? What do I want to do? And it's a challenge. So thank you all for coming along with me today. And I am going to stop the recording.